Pretty good packed house today. My name is Gaming Yi. I'm the Technical Director of the I4 Energy Center. Welcome everyone here and welcome those on the web to today's I4 Energy Seminar. Today's speaker is Shmuel Oren. He is the Earl J. Isaac Chair Professor in the Science and Analysis of Decision Making in the Department of Industrial Engineering and Operational Research at the University of California here in Berkeley. He is the Berkeley Site Director of the Power Systems Engineering Research Center, PSERP, which I believe is funded by NSF. He served as a consultant on electricity market design to various private and public organizations in the U.S. and also abroad, including the Market Oversight Division of the Public Utilities Commission of Texas, the Energy Division of the California Public Utility Commission, and the California ISO, and the Bonneville Power Authority. Dr. Oren holds a BS and MS degree in mechanical engineering from the Technion University in Israel, and a MS and PhD degree in engineering economics systems from Stanford University. He is a fellow of INFORMS and the IEEE. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome.
Am I on the speaker now? Yeah. Okay. Some of you may have heard my talk last semester in the IOR, so not to bore you, I'll try to make it a little different. Hopefully the students among you after this talk will be compelled to take some of our courses in optimization, which I'm teaching, and some of my colleagues. So what I want to do is to give you a little overview on how electricity markets operate and some of the background that led to the design, because when you look at it as a final product, some of the features of those markets may look odd to some people. So let me start in the mid-90s. The U.S., many states in the U.S. have deregulated their electricity industry from what was traditionally an integrated system, a monopoly, where the PG&E or Southern California Edison were controlling everything from the generation all the way to the customers, including transmission, distribution, and everything at the customer sites. What the regulation has done is to privatize the generation sector, and the state, everything past the high voltage lines is still regulated by the state under the CPUC and other state utilities, but the transmission system, the high voltage transmission system, has been now operated by the independent system operator, which in the current structure, the system operator controls the wires and the power, the market for power, the wholesale market for power. We started in California with those two pieces being separate, but now since about a year and a half, for the last actually 8 years probably, they are managed together. Transmission owners are basically just getting a regulated rate of return for the wires, but they don't have any control on the wires. And what the system operator is doing is getting schedules, bids and asks from generators and load-serving entities, and dispatches the resources and sets prices. Just for those of you who are not familiar, the U.S. is really divided into 3 interconnected grids, which splits along the Rockies. ERCOT, Texas, most of Texas is still operating separately from the rest of the U.S., like in many other things. And but the main 2 pieces are the interconnect, the Western interconnect and the Eastern interconnect. The deregulation started with the intention of converting the entire system into regional transmission organization, but then there were a lot of political opposition. So what we ended is with a checkerboard where about 70% of the load now is served by a regional transmission organization operated by independent system operators, which are non-profit organizations that are running the system. They are, you have California Independent System Operator, ERCOT, New England ISO, New York ISO, Midwest ISO, and PJM, which is the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland ISO that now is probably the biggest electric power systems in the world. Just to give you a scale, the PJM serves, there are 600 plus market participants in the wholesale market. They serve 51 million people, 150 gigawatt of power, and there is basically the region that they control accounts for about 20% of the US GDP. So it's a large system. Now, the way the system is being run is by a series of markets for various products that are needed to support the delivery of power. So what we have is the day-ahead energy market, it's 24 hours in advance, a real-time energy market, financial transmission rights, and those are primarily what I will talk about. Then there is a market for regulation capacity. That's the generation capacity that's supposed to follow the load on a very short time scale. Then you have operating reserves with different time readiness, spinning reserves, non-spinning reserve, and replacement reserves. And then in some jurisdictions, there are forward capacity markets which are designed to encourage investment in generation capacity 3 and 4 years in advance. Now, the way those markets are running, so let's start with the with the day-ahead market. So the day-ahead market is basically a market that is designed to commit units 24 hours because it takes quite a while to start a unit. So it's a market that's designed to commit units 24 hours in advance and to set prices for each hour, and that's the day-ahead market. And the way it's being run is by a very large mixed integer programming formulation that minimizes the total of the fuel cost, no load cost, which means the cost of just keeping the generator at minimum load, a startup cost, and there's a whole bunch of constraints. And the constraints include load balance constraints, unit output constraints, unit ramp limits, because the unit cannot ramp up and down more than at a certain rate, a minimum uptime, minimum downtime, a transmission constraint, which at that level are approximated by using a direct current approximation of Kirchhoff's law, and the reserve margin requirement, and contingencies. And usually we operate the system under an N-1 contingency rule, which means that if any one element in the network fails, the system can still run. So the solution is still feasible. So basically what generators are providing in their day-ahead bids, in the day-ahead bids, what they are providing is three-part offers. They're providing information about their startup cost, about the no-load cost. They're also providing technical data about the ramp constraints, but that's they don't provide it every day. And then they're providing a supply curve which says how much money they want depending on the quantity that they are going to be dispatched. So what the system operator then is doing after running this optimization problem makes all the on-off decisions of which generators are going to be on, which generators are going to be off, what the output level at the generators, how much reserve they need to procure, and they set locational marginal prices, which means that they set prices at each bus in the system in such a way that the people, it will be it basically uses Lagrange multipliers, for those of you who know what that means, shadow prices, and setting the prices at the cost of serving the last megawatt at that particular node. Then, to give you a scale, this is an example that we use in a lot of test problems, and it's called the IEEE 118 bus test network. And sometimes it's quite challenging to solve even that. The scale of the problem that the ISO solves with 2 hours before the market is set every day, they have a PJM, it's 1,200 generators, each submitting 3-part offers, startup, no load cost, and then a supply curve consisting of 10 increments. There are 10,000 demand bids, fixed price or price-sensitive demand, 50,000 virtual bids, and I'll come back to that in a middle. Then there are essentially 8,700 eligible offers, and then you have 6,000 transmission elements that are being monitored, and 10,000 transmission contingencies, which means that you have 10,000 elements that are being taken out and to make sure that the system will still run if they will fail. Now, the virtual bids is kind of interesting because what the virtual bids are is bids by entities that don't own any generation, like Morgan Stanley or Salmon Brothers or, speculators that are thinking that the price in the day ahead is different than the price in real time, and they try to arbitrage the difference between the prices. So they will submit bids in the day ahead and then close them in real time. And if you think about it, that's kind of the thing that Enron was doing when they were manipulating the market. The problem with Enron is that the market at that point, in California especially, was not designed to handle those kind of bids. So at that time, it was considered market manipulation. Now, that kind of activity is legal because the market accounts for that, and it was just instituted in California within the last 6 months, I believe, or so. So this is an important part. So this is an auction that is being run, and the auction is settled by this huge optimization model that is being run every day for every hour, 24 hours ahead. Then, in real time, we have a second market for deviations which are optimized every 5 minutes. And this is now, at this point, all the generators that are going to run are set. All the integer variables in the optimization are being fixed. And what you are solving is a nonlinear optimization model with the same granularity as the previous one, except that now you use an alternative current model with voltage and thermal limits, and you minimize the total cost of generation fuel subject to energy balance, generator limit, transmission constraint, reserve requirements. And again, what the bidders, the generators, are submitting bids every 15 minutes, and the problem is resolved every 5 minutes. And what you get out of that is locational marginal prices for the settlement, and which are basically calculated by linearizing this model around the operating point and solving an LP that sets up the Lagrange multipliers, and those are the marginal cost, which tells you how much would it cost, or what would be the impact on the objective function if you were increasing the demand at that location by small increment. And that sets the price at every unit. So, to give you an example, if you had, for example, 2 locations, ideally you would want, and there is a transmission constraint, ideally you would want to operate the system in such a way that the marginal price at both locations would be the same. And in that case, you would serve you would produce 120 megawatt here, 50 megawatt here, so that the total is 160, and 170, but the problem is that if you do that, that would imply that you have to export from the west to the east 40 megawatt. The line can only carry 26. So what you have to do is to back down the generation on the west down to 106, increase generation on the east, but then the marginal cost here is going to be $40, the marginal cost here is going to be $50. So those are going to be the marginal cost of the last unit produced. That's going to be the price that is going to be charged to everybody at each one of these locations. So now, if you try to scale that to a larger dimension, it basically becomes a nonlinear optimization model. So I have to show you some equations. So basically, the way you measure benefit is that if this would be the inverse demand function, saying how much people are willing to pay for every incremental megawatt, then that area under this curve measures the benefit to society. This is the cost. You take the benefit minus the cost, and you add it over all the nodes, and you end up with an optimization model saying you're maximizing social benefit subject to a constraint that says that the energy balance, and then you have transmission constraints which are reflected by a big matrix that tells you that if you put a megawatt here and you take it at another location, how the power is going to flow through the network. So you have a big matrix telling you the distribution factors for this transmission. So if you take necessary condition for that, I won't go through all that, but the important result is that the price at each location, which is determined by the inverse demand function at the quantity consisting of the local production and the import to export, is going to equal to some reference price plus a locational markup. And the markup is going to be changed from each point in the network depending on the transmission constraint. So this is something that the optimization produces as a byproduct. And now, to give you an example, at PJM, this is something that you can download from the network, and this was done in July. So what you see is kind of a contour map showing you the prices throughout the East Coast. So you can see that the price in Minnesota is going to be $43 here, while the price up in New Jersey is $300. Quite a significant difference. And the colors represent how high the price is. In fact, the granularity of the solution is much higher than those points that you see. Those are called trading hubs, where you take the average of nodes within a 100-kilometer radius, and you set the price so that the traders can settle their settlements based on those prices. But in fact, the generators and the consumers are actually being charged and paid based on the marginal cost at their particular node. Now, this changes very fast because you get that updated every 5 minutes. So let's look at this. So at 5:35 in the afternoon, you had the price at the Eastern Hub, $129, in Minnesota, $25. Then 10 minutes later, you have 125 and 38. Another 5 minutes later, the price went from 125 to 140, and then an hour later went from 140 to 73, and from 29 to 22. Now, sometimes you get all kinds of interesting phenomena. Like this was a picture that shows you that while the price at this particular point in time, which was September 2010 at 3 in the afternoon, the price in New Jersey was $172, while the price in Minnesota was minus $1,365. That means that there must have been some generators there that are maybe coal generators that would rather pay a penalty than shutting down because it's so expensive to shut down the generator. So the generators are actually competing on who is going to stay on. And if you have a big tanker of water and you can ship it there in a hurry, you can heat the water and make a lot of money doing that because they'll pay you for consuming electricity. This also illustrates why it's so important when you're talking about energy efficiency to understand that you cannot address energy efficiency problem unless you understand the granularity of the cost. Because you can save energy in Minnesota and actually hurt the system. I mean, trying to, energy conservation is actually going to increase the cost. So energy conservation is actually going to be harmful at this point in Minnesota. So those price signals, however, so for example, if you have a lot of wind and a lot of minimum, over-generation, you're going to see negative prices. And that's important. It makes a lot of sense from an economic point of view because it gives the right control signal to the generators to whether they should shut down, and they respond to those prices very effectively. Now, this is not an isolated phenomenon. I just went on yesterday on the web and look, and sure enough, we had another one of those negative prices down in this area. And now you see the map actually reversed because it's winter. So in fact, the prices are higher in Minnesota than on the West Coast. So here we see the price is negative while the price in Wisconsin was high. Maybe it's because of the demonstrations there, I don't know, but that could be one of the reasons. And again, the price changes very rapidly. 10 minutes later, the map has changed and the price has gone actually up in Wisconsin to $362. And another 5 minutes later, again, prices go down. So the market, this is an indication that the generators and the system responds very quickly. And this is the best way to communicate where is the congestion and how prices are changing. And these are the kind of price signals that we need to drive our demand response and all the energy efficiency measures, because those are true economic signals that tell you how much it costs to supply electricity at every location. Now, the reason that you have such high volatility is because of the nature of the supply stack, that if you look at the supply function, the demand is very inelastic, and the supply, when you reach capacity, is very steep. So very small changes, very small variations on the demand side can cause big variations in the marginal cost of the last megawatt. And when you look at the pattern, so you have a lot of intertemporal volatility and spatial volatility of prices. This shows you how prices behaved in ERCOT in Texas, kind of the average prices between 2002 and 2007, and you have a lot of spikes. Now you see this here, the prices go from $50 to $400. Now just this month, on February 2nd, we have this big freeze in Texas where they dropped 7,000 megawatt because the whole 50 generators went offline, and this was the price. It went within very short period of time from the regular price of about $50 to $3,000. So this was, and the price at $3,000 held for, you see, over 6 hours. So you can imagine that if you are not signing contracts in advance to lock in the price, a lot of retail companies are going belly up within a day, because this gets multiplied by many thousands of megawatts, and the companies can lose tens of millions of dollars in very few hours. So, but the reality is that this is exactly the kind of price signal that you want, because this is the kind of a price signal that will convince somebody to shut down the factory, send people home, and save and cut down on electricity consumption, because they are going to make more money by not consuming electricity than on anything they can produce with it. So this is a very correct price signal that you don't want to smooth it out. Now, what people do, though, to protect themselves, and we learned it the hard way in California during the energy crisis, is sign forward contracts. And forward contracts are the price variation in forward contracts is much smaller. And so what you do, you essentially lock in the price, and you sign what's called contract for differences, which means that the buyer and the seller are still trading with the system operator and paying the marginal price. However, they may compensate each other for the difference between what the marginal price was and what their agreed upon price was. So de facto, they pay a fixed price. And that's the kind of contracts that PG&E will sign in order to supply its residential customers. However, there is a price. So if you look at, for example, a company like PG&E, they the generator sell to the wholesale market, PG&E will pay the marginal price for the electricity, and then they have to supply residential customers or even commercial customers at fixed rates, which are being determined by the CPUC. However, so they try to protect themselves against the exposure that they have by signing long-term contracts. The problem is that a lot of the prices are correlated with demand. And the way the electricity system works is that the utility doesn't have much control over how much people consume. You can turn the switch on and take any amount of electricity that you want. So chances are that when PG&E signs a contract, the time when they will be short in their forward contracting and they will have to go and buy the difference on the spot market is exactly the time when the price is going to be very high. And the time when they over-contracted and they're going to have to sell it on the spot market to basically dump the extra electricity that they have purchased, then the price is going to be low. So trying to balance these books becomes a very challenging financial problem, and that's why PG&E is now, the people that they are hiring is people that traditionally would have gone to Wall Street, that they know how to deal with contracting and hedging, and it's becoming a financial problem. So there are different ways to try to hedge against this quantity variation. Demand response is, of course, the natural thing, and that would be, once we have all the smart metering, that will be one way to try to induce customers when the prices are high to cut down on their electricity consumption. There are weather derivatives where people are actually buying derivatives that are being, where the payoff depends on the average temperature, and the temperature is highly correlated with demand. There are something called swing options where you exercise, where you have an option with a strike price, but the exercise quantity can be varied within a range. We have all kinds of options portfolios, and we have dynamic adjustments in the contract position. So they have a whole slew of analysts now sitting and figuring out how to sign their contracts in order to optimize their procurement in this new brave market. So now the other type of exposures that utilities encounter, or any kinds of load-serving entity, are the locational variation. You buy electricity, for example, at California-Oregon border, and then you have to deliver down in Los Angeles, you are going to be exposed to the locational price difference between those two locations. And this is, as we saw, this changes very rapidly, and you have to somehow protect yourself against that risk. So market participants end up, no matter how you deal with it, so there are two ways that you can take power in the north and deliver it to the south. One of them is you take the power that you get across the border from Oregon and you sell it to the ISO at the location at the Oregon border, and then you buy it back from the ISO in Los Angeles at the other price, or you can sign a bilateral contract in which you submit a schedule. You say, I want to put power here and take it out there, and then the ISO is going to send you a bill for the congestion charge, and the congestion charge is going to be exactly the same as the difference between the locational marginal prices. So either way, you're going to be exposed to this price difference, and the way the way utilities try to hedge that is there is something called a financial transmission rights. So the transmission system is operated by the system operator, but then it's being sold in the form of financial rights to the market participants. And what those financial rights do is that they give you financial instruments that is going to pay you the difference between the marginal price at one location and the marginal price at another location. It's kind of a swap. It's the same thing as manufacturers that, for example, export cars from Japan to the United States, will buy hedges that will protect themselves against the fluctuation in currency between the yen and the dollar in order to protect themselves for losses due to changes in exchange rates. So this is a locational swap, and the way those are being structured is that you define those FTRs as LMP swaps, and then the FTRs are available. You can buy those financial transmission rights are available either as options, which means that if that value turns negative, you can walk away from them, or as obligations where you would be liable if the sign of the difference changes. The FTRs are sold through auctions, and they are usually sold up to 2 years ahead, and the granularity depends on the different ISOs. And then every month there is a reconfiguration auction where people can buy and sell those rights that they have. So if we look, for example, in Texas, the way they define originally their transmission rights is 2 years in monthly granularity, and then in blocks of hours, which are divided into 8-hour pieces. So basically, you buy that right, and then it means that during those hours and during that particular month, that right is like a security that is going to pay you the difference between two locations. Now, the reason that you buy that is because you are going to have to pay to the ISO the difference in a congestion charge. So if you have those rights exactly in the amount of the transaction of energy that you're going to have, then that's going to offset each other, so you are protected against the congestion charge, because what you get paid for the security, you have to pay back for the congestion. Now, one of the problems is that the ISO that manages all that has to make sure that the income that they get from the congestion charges, either through the differences between prices at injection point and prices at the withdrawal point, or through transmission congestion payment for the bilateral transactions, they have to make sure that the money that comes in is going to be sufficient to pay for those rights. The same way as, people in Social Security, they have to make sure that the Social Security income that comes in is enough to pay to all the retirees. So it's a cash flow arrangement, and the way we guarantee that that will be the case, that's called revenue adequacy, is making sure that if everybody that holds a transmission right, a financial transmission right, were actually executing that right as a physical transactions, that the network could sustain that. So basically, you have to solve a power flow problem, an optimization model, and this is an example. If you have if you have a 3-node system here, and you inject here, and you take the power out here, then this is a nomogram that gives you all the feasible combinations of injection G1 and G2 that are going to be the system that will not violate those limits. So you can see that. So what the auction for those transmission rights is doing is that people are submitting bids for how much they want transmission rights from point 1 to 3, and how much they want from point 2 to 3. All the feasible combinations are represented by this polyhedron, and now you're trying to maximize the auction revenue subject to that. That's a linear programming problem, big linear programming problem, because there are a lot of bids, thousands of bids, and that sets the price for those rights. So this is another layer of optimization where you are running the auction and imposing what's known as simultaneous feasibility constraints. Now, why does it have to be so complicated? This is something that was a cartoon that was published after the deregulation, where it kind of shows that deregulation drives us into the Stone Age. Well, let me show you. The original designs in California and in Texas of those systems was much simpler. Originally, the idea was that instead of bothering with all this very granular system and all this optimization, let's let people trade an amount of energy, ignore kind of use what we called the Copperplate Model, where you can inject any amount that you want, take any amount that you want. And then the system operator will fix it. The system operator will look at the transactions that people submitted and will decide, okay, we are going to overload this line, so we are going to counter trade with the parties. If a line is being overloaded, let's ask the people on the export side to back off some of their export, the people of the import side to increase their output, and this way we'll pay them for that. So this was the general idea. And so the idea is like that, you know, if this line represents you have export location and import location, and presumably the export location power is cheaper than here. So this line represents like a supply function, the avoided cost as a function of how much you export, and this is the cost of how much it will cost you to produce on this side. So what you want is you want to set the level, if the system didn't have any constraint, this will be the optimum amount of export, at which point the amount that you are saving by reducing the generation here equals exactly to the price of the marginal megawatt that you're producing here. So this is a classic supply and demand kind of function, and that would be your point. However, suppose that the system can only tolerate this amount, so what you have to do is to back down those transactions. And the way the design was originally in California is that you are going to, so this becomes the marginal price on the import location. This is the marginal price at the export location. So what you are doing, you're paying all the exporters this price to buy back. In other words, they will buy back their excess production at this price, which is less than what they were paid for initially, so they will be happy. And these guys, you pay them to increase their production and pay this amount, and again, they will be willing to do that, so this will becomes the cost of mitigating that congestion. So this was the general idea, and the underlying philosophy behind that is that in reality, the situation is more like that. That you have you have a 1,000 megawatt line, and maybe it's exceeded by 100 megawatt, so it's relatively cheap to pay people to relieve congestion of this extra megawatt, 100 megawatt here, and then you just socialize it. You spread it over the rest of the population, and it will be a small percentage of the bill, and this is a much simpler way to do that, because then people can trade without having all this granularity. The problem is that there's something called the deck game. And the deck game means that when you do that, there is nothing to prevent people that schedule bilateral transactions for overscheduling, and then they get paid more to relieve phantom congestion that supposedly it's going to exist. So they pretend that they need to ship much more power, and then the ISO looks at the schedules and say, wait a minute, but we can only do that, so they have to pay them that amount. So you see that becomes an opportunity for gaming. And sure enough, so first of all, those of you who have seen my car understand now why I have license plate deck game.
You get a lot of money on the deck game.
Yeah. So, but that's, this was an article in the paper. That's exactly the game that Enron was playing in California. They would overschedule transactions, create phantom congestion, then being paid for relieving congestion that they created. This was called Dead Star strategy, and they had a whole bunch of strategies. At some other point in California, they actually ended up introducing another zone, because again the deck game was played along this divide between the north and the south. And then in Texas, at that time they thought that Texas has learned everything there is to learn from the California crisis, so they decided that we can handle that. We don't really have congestion in Texas. So what they ended up doing, Texas has 3 major zones, and you see pretty much the flows there. So what they ended up doing is designing a market where, again, they didn't charge anything from congestion. They were going to pay people to buy back their power and relieve congestion. And I was a consultant at that point, and Pat Wood was the chairman of the commission, and I explained to him what the deck game is all about. So he said, okay, so let's put this precaution, and if the cost of relieving congestion in a year goes over $20 million, then we'll institute a more granular system. And then they did it within the zone. If it goes over $20 million, then we'll institute it even more granular system. Well, once they started the market, within 3 weeks, the congestion cost already $55 million. So immediately they moved to the more granular system at the zonal level, but it took them another 8 years to actually do it at the full scale. So this was the example how it happened. There was all this consistent overscheduling. I mean, this is an example how people overscheduled load and underscheduled generation and created these phantom transactions. And then this was an example where a company overscheduled the load in the North Zone. This was actually Enron, that only had like 1.5 megawatt of power, and they scheduled 3,000 megawatts. And they were making money off that. So this shows you how much it costs to deal with that. You know, these were just 2 days in August of 2001, and $18 million, $14 million just to do this buyback in order to relieve the congestion, because the market wasn't prepared for that. So what happened was that, so they did an investigation. They found out that there was like $100 million was collected by these market participants that play this game. And basically the lesson from all that is that you cannot do that. That this doesn't work because it creates all this gaming opportunity, and the only way to deal with congestion is that you impose what we call congestion rent, which means that you charge for the flow that is actually going to be executed times the locational marginal price differences, and then it doesn't matter, because even if people overschedule, then they have to pay for the overscheduling, and they get back, so they are not going to make any money. And that's why now virtual bidding is possible, because we changed the system so that now people, if they overschedule in the virtual bidding, then they will have to pay it back. The epilogue of this whole story was that interzonal congestion charges were activated in February, right immediately after the market opened, within a month. The interzonal congestion uplift, so then it went away, all this problem disappeared, but the qualified service entity actually ended up paying a penalty, because the lawyers were managed to prove that they violated the spirit of the protocols by playing this game, so they ended up being slapped and paying $25 million penalty, which was only a fraction of the money they made. And what happened, but this is kind of to show you what happened afterwards. So you see, right after the zonal congestion, the granularity at the zonal level was introduced. The zonal congestion cost went down tremendously, but people were playing the same game now within the zones. And by the time the market went live, around it was last December 1st, that the full nodal market became active in Texas, the cumulative cost of relieving congestion inside the zones reached, which was supposed to be $20 million a year, reached almost $2 billion. So that's why we need a complicated system. Because if you have a simple system, people are gaming it. So this is kind of the end result. As I said, in Texas, the new rule was implemented in 2004, and the nodal market finally became alive in December 1. In California, there is something called MRTU, which is a market reform and technology update, which again went live in 2009 and in April 1st. And so now basically all the ISOs operate on this nodal granularity. Now, people often ask me, was the regulation a good idea after all? Well, it was a good theory, and so this basically says, for those of you who cannot try it, if you just keep harping on the results, you'll never be able to see what a perfectly sound economic theory it was. Well, it's hard to tell. You know, I mean, there is some evidence that, in fact, that the heat rate improved, that the efficiency of generation has improved. And people have done some econometric study, and they showed that there's been improving efficiency. Whether customers benefited from that, that's a different question. And it's not clear that customers actually, you know, that it's possible that all those efficiency gains have gone to the producers. And but the bottom line is that this is water under the bridge. I mean, all these ISOs spend of the order of $700 million for the infrastructure for this new market, so they are not going to change it. So this is something to live with, and the question is what's next. So just a few more minutes. So this is kind of the brave new world that we are getting into. Now you're going to have batteries, and so the generation is going to be much more distributed. You're going to have demand response. So obviously these optimizations are going to get even more complicated. So, you know, I've just talked to the people at Lawrence Livermore, and they have a supercomputer there that occupies a whole building and uses 30 megawatt of power just to cool it. So they are eager to try to solve these optimization problems now using their supercomputer. And probably that's where we are heading, that we'll need more and more computational power to be able to do that. This just shows you, this is from the ISO, but the idea, the problem is that you see, even if you look at the complementarity between wind and solar, there are still going to be here big gaps which require a lot of ramping capability that is not available now, and either you're going to build a lot of very fast gas plants that are going to sit idle most of the time and only operate to fill in the gaps, and that's kind of very expensive, or we're going to rely more and more on demand response, which is really I think the right solution for this kind of situation. But the problem is that not only that you have this variability, you also have uncertainty. This is another picture published by the ISO showing that when you use wind, you don't really know what the wind is going to be next 24 hours. So the question is, how can you do this optimization? Well, we will have to move from using deterministic mixed integer programming at the wide scale to use the stochastic mixed integer programming. And that's the next generation of algorithms that we are looking at, of actually using stochastic unit commitment that can account for all these uncertainties. The smart grid is trying to address a lot of these things at different levels, demand response, PHEVs, and all this conservation measure at the customer side, substation automation, at the substation, storage, PMUs, phasor measurements units, SCADA. All these are the new technologies that are going to come on, but that just increases the need for information technology and computation to deal with that, to make the grid smarter. So the emerging issues, and this is my last slide, are in the renewable integration area. We have to deal with trying to mitigate supply and demand uncertainty and resource variability. We have to deal with we need more sophisticated planning tools that are going to tell us whether it's worth to build a transmission line to the wind farm or not. We need to upgrade all this to optimization from deterministic to stochastic optimization. And enabling customer choice and demand response is a big area that a lot of people here are working on. Improving visibility and control with SCADA, phasor measurement units, dynamic optimization. One of the things that we can talk about is that the next generation of those unit commitments are not only going to tell us which generators to dispatch on and off, but you can also co-optimize the topology of the network along with it by switching lines in and out, because sometimes by switching a line out, you actually relieve congestion, and you are not compromising anything. Impact of, the big elephant in the room is what's going to be the impact of PHEVs and EVs, utilization and impact of mass storage, and overall, how is all that going to impact carbon regulation? We see, for example, that you can actually, sometimes different forms of carbon regulation are going to have impacts on how the net grid is being operated. So this is it.
Thank you, Shmuel. Fascinating talk. My PG needle doesn't look that complicated anymore now. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you mentioned that the study of this complicated market system showed that there was some increase in thermal efficiency. But is there anything that tells us whether this has produced a more robust system in the sense of better able to respond to disturbance?
I think that more robustness comes from the fact that by trying to build this system, they improve a lot. Like, for example, when we had in 2003 the big blackout in New York, the East Coast, there have been some studies showing that if the whole area was integrated and they were getting those locational marginal prices, that they could have prevented it, because that would have provided the control signal in a more timely fashion. That much of the problem was non-visibility. So this pricing system provides a way, control signals which are very effective.
I wonder if you could speak to the effect of geographic scale on the efficiency of the market. That is, for instance, on the map you showed PJM and the Midwest ISO essentially as one joint area, right? And there are advantages you can think of, obviously, for doing business across a wider area because you have more and more diverse resources. On the other hand, the congestion impacts become greater, and also you have more computational difficulties. So is there anything you can say about what would be an optimal scale for balancing authorities, or conversely, under what assumptions that you can make about the way they do business are the outcomes scale invariant?
Well, there are problems with the seams, because when you have two regions and at the seams you have different prices on both sides, the ability of traders to kind of try to blend those differences through trading is limited. And there is one study that was done by trying to remember the authors, but anyway, they were demonstrating the before and after effect on prices when they were PJM, I think Dominion joined PJM or something like that, that a piece that was not in PJM joined the PJM, and and they were doing a before and after study, and they show that they were able to capture gains from trade that were not being able to capture before. So increasing the geographical scope of the network improves the efficiency of that optimization. Of course, we are then limited by computation ability, the size. I mean, we're getting now state estimators of magnitude that we haven't seen before. So getting visibility when you have such a diversity. But overall, I think the common wisdom is that the bigger, if we could have the whole Eastern and Western interconnect integrated into just two ISOs, there would be some efficiency gains, because across the borders, we are not able to completely capture the gains from trade if we don't have the system dispatched over one unit. The reason that you see the PJM and the MISO operating now fairly integrated is that PJM is actually buying transmission rights. Because the problem is that you have such a big region that a lot of the loop flow is going through MISO. So you have to actually somehow coordinate, make sure that your marginal megawatt that flows across your territory is worth just as much as their marginal megawatt. And that's what the market does automatically, of making sure that you balance the value of what you're doing with a certain amount of transmission capacity. Yes?
Can you comment on,
Yeah.
any comments on whether markets should be changed to accommodate 20 to 32% wind and solar?
Well, the market is not going to change. There is too much invested. California invested $700 million in their IT and the market design, Texas. So I think whatever design we have, it's here to stay. What we're going to see is only incremental improvements. So this is kind of a moot question at this point. We're seeing, and in fact, the only comparison that we can make is that we're looking at Europe and the Europeans, which have been much more resistant to trying to adopt this kind of market granularity, because they are now starting to realize that, for example, in England, they finally start to recognize that if they're building 10 gigawatt of wind power in Scotland, and they cannot bring it to London because they have these physical transmission right systems instead of the financial transmission right. So they have the option either to build another 10 gigawatt of transmission capacity, or to figure out, to essentially monetize the transmission right and convert them to a financial system so that people will have the incentive to convert. So, one of the benefits, for example, of having a system of transmission right like that is that if you have a thermal generator sitting here and I'm a windmill, and the thermal generator owns transmission capacity, then it's to their advantage to give me the right to produce, because they will make more money by me lowering the locational price, and they will collect more money on their financial transmission right than if they were generating themselves. So there is a natural incentive here to give way to the most efficient resource, and that's the problem that they have in Europe with all these physical rights. So the way the market is designed now, I think it's actually working pretty well, and I think that it's just a matter of improving it's being challenged now by all these new renewables and all that, but I don't think it's a problem with the market. It's a problem with improving the optimization software and making it do more and faster. Yes?
I wonder if you ever thought about, in what you describe here, there's only really one entity controlling a single region and matching supply and demand. Right. And then as the regions become bigger and the players become smaller and more variable, it becomes more and more complicated. Have you ever thought about creating multiple entities at different regional scales that match the supply and demand at different time scales, so that your role for, say, a smaller region wouldn't be to completely match supply and demand, would just be to have it not fluctuate too much, so you could have kind of nested structures? Yeah,
there is a lot of work now on microgrids. And people are looking at, okay, could we, for example, have move in the direction where instead of having this large grid where we are trying to maintain frequency tolerances of 0.035 hertz, whether we could restructure the system so you'll have microgrids that balance their supply and demand locally and take care of quality of power locally, and then you'll have a backbone that is much more tolerant, that you'll be able to relax the relays and make the power, the frequency much more fluctuate. And that's one of the kind of paradigm that people are looking at. So the idea, so the research of microgrid is probably moving in the direction that you describe, of trying to have more local balancing. We are doing some work, for example, one of my students, on trying to see whether you could match electric vehicles with wind power, so that to the ISO, they'll look at the net, and the net would look much less volatile than if you dump everything through the ISO. So you could have, for example, a paradigm where the load will follow the intermittent resources so that the ISO would only see the net, and that net will be much more stable. So these are the kind of things. So the question is how to organize it. When you're doing that, you're losing the gains from diversity. Because when you do everything to the ISO, you know, the wind, there is geographical diversity of wind, that, and there is all kinds of benefits. So the integration, increasing the scale, has the benefit that you are you have the potential of getting more gains from trade and more an account, and some of the uncertainties offset each other. But and you know, with the technology moving the way it is, there is no real barriers for doing that. So it's not clear. You have to make the case whenever you're saying, I'm going to try to balance things locally and then submit it to the ISO, and so that the ISO won't see a lot of this variation. It's a hard case to make from an economic point of view.
So now that transmission operators actually generate their revenues from congestion charges, are there any incentives left for actual investments in infrastructure?
No, they don't generate. The wires are, the congestion charges is just a mechanism for controlling congestion. And it's almost, so basically, as I said, the congestion charges are being used to pay off to the transmission rights owners. So the income that the ISO collects is just from auctioning off the transmission right. That's what they keep. The congestion charges in real time are used to offset the transmission right payoffs. Now, that money is used toward paying to the owners of the wires, but it doesn't cover all the rate of return. So there is a complete disassociation. So the wires are not relying on congestion charges to make money. They are being paid regulated rate of return for their investment. So the decision whether to invest or not is made by regional planning algorithms that are looking at the benefit, because the benefits sometimes are scattered and it's very hard to collect from the right people.
Okay, just two more questions because there's another event coming on the auditorium. So.
Yeah, so we have this big optimization problem, and it's ever growing. So at some point there is some limits to it, right? What is the viability of solving it in a distributed fashion, and what are the challenges and the main problems with doing that?
Well, I don't know. You know, we're working on solving bigger and bigger problems. If you look at the kind of optimization, like those unit commitment problems, you couldn't solve them 10 years ago, and now CPLEX kind of whips through them. So, so the software, I mean, we have seen tremendous improvement in the computer power and in the algorithms. And I think that the next challenge is probably to try to learn. We haven't done a good job on parallelizing a lot of this optimization problem, of trying to use, you know, high-performance computing. So there is a big area there that can be.
But you're still thinking about one centralized solving thing, because it's also the communication constraints, and if you have ever finer granularity, I think that might eventually become a problem. What's your thought on that?
You know, I mean, I think that it is just a matter of developing better and better algorithms. You know, what we are seeing now is that with all this demand, smart metering and all the PMU data, we definitely, the rate at which we're getting more data is faster than our ability to process it. But I don't think that we are even close to any kind of limit on that. I mean, it's not, I think that our ability to solve large optimization problem is still, there is a lot of work to be done that can be improved.
Last question.
Yes.
What's the prospect for large-scale storage, and how does that change implications for the market or the organization of the market or the system?
Well, storage, you know, people have worked, I mean, storage is not something new. I mean, people have worked, if you look at There are countries like Norway where 97% of their power is hydro, and a lot of that hydro is pumped storage. So we know how to deal with massive storage. Probably what we know less is how to deal with distributed storage and how to deal with virtual storage that is embedded in every thermal, in every building, and there are so many applications where the load can be shifted because there is inherent storage in the task that we are trying to perform. So, so that's probably the bigger challenge. Learning how to use storage and what's the value. As I said, we know how to solve large stochastic dynamic programming problems that will optimize the use of storage. So I don't see that as such a big challenge.
Well, thank you very much, Shmuel.